Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Pam Reads. Today we are continuing in our story A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. And we stopped in the middle of chapter 25 last time, so we're going to continue with that one. And what had happened in our last video is that blonde weed, as Ove calls his neighbor across the street with mutt dog, had tried to attack his cat, and he stopped them and let the cat come inside. All right, so continuing, he says, tag along then, he urges the cat without looking at it. Let's give that village cur something to think about. Ove puts on the navy winter jacket, steps into his clogs, and lets the cat walk out the door first. He looks at the photo of Sonia on the wall. She laughs back at him. Maybe it's not so enormously important to die that it can't wait an hour, thinks Ove, and follows the cat into the street. He goes to Rune's house, where it takes several minutes before the door opens. There's a slow dragging sound inside before anything happens with the lock, as if a ghost is approaching with heavy chains rattling behind it. Then, finally, it opens, and Rune stands there looking at Ove and the cat with an empty stare. "You got any corrugated iron?" wonders Ove, without allowing any time for small talk. Rune gives him a concentrated stare for a second or two, as if his brain is fighting desperately to produce a memory. "Corrugated iron?" he says to himself, as if tasting the word, like someone who's just woken up and is intensely trying to remember what he's been dreaming. "Corrugated iron, that's it," says Ove with a nod. Rune looks at him, or rather, he looks straight through him. His eyes have a gleam of a newly waxed car hood. He's emaciated and hunchbacked. His beard is gray, bordering on white. This used to be a solid bloke, commanding a bit of respect, but now his clothes hang on his body in rags. He's grown old. Very, very old, Ove realizes, and it hits him with a force he hadn't quite counted on. Rune's gaze flickers for a moment, then his mouth starts twitching. "Ove?" he exclaims. "Yeah, well, one thing's for sure, I'm not the Pope," Ove replies. The baggy skin on Rune's face cracks into a sleepy smile. Both men, once as close as men of that sort could be, stare at each other. One of them, a man who refuses to forget the past, and one who can't remember it at all. "You look old," says Ove. Rune grins. Then Anita's anxious voice makes itself heard, and in the next moment, her small drumming feet are bearing her at speed towards the door. "Is there someone at the door, Rune? What are you doing there?" she calls out, terrified, as she appears in the doorway. Then she sees Ove. "Oh, hello, Ove," she says, and stops abruptly. Ove stands there with his hands in his pockets. The cat beside him looks as if it would do the same, if it had pockets, or hands. Anita is small and colorless in her gray trousers, gray knitted cardigan, gray hair, and gray skin. But Ove notices that her face is slightly red-eyed and swollen. Quickly she wipes her eyes and blinks away the pain, as women of that generation do, as if they stood in the doorway every morning determinedly driving sorrow out of the house with a broom, Tenderly, she takes Rune by the shoulders and leads him to his wheelchair by the window in the living room. "Hello, Ove," she repeats in a friendly, also surprised voice when she comes back to the door. "What can I do for you?" "Do you have any corrugated iron?" he asks back. She looks puzzled. "Corrected iron?" she mumbles, as if the iron has somehow been wrong and now someone has to put it right. Ove sighs deeply. Good God. Corrugated iron. Anita doesn't like the slightest bit less puzzled. "Am I supposed to have some?" "Rune will have some in his shed, definitely," says Ove and holds out his hand. Anita nods, takes down the shed key from the wall, and puts it in Ove's hand. "Corrugated iron?" she says again. "Yes," says Ove, "but we don't have a metal roof." "What's that got to do with it?" Anita shakes her head. No, maybe it doesn't, of course. "One always has a bit of sheet metal," says Ove, as if this was absolutely beyond dispute. Anita nods, as one does when faced with the undeniable fact that a bit of corrugated iron is the sort of thing that all normal, right-thinking people keep lying about in their sheds, just in case there's a call for it. "But don't you have any of that metal yourself, then?" she tries, mainly to have something to talk about. "I've used mine up," says Ove. Anita nods understandingly, as one does when facing the indisputable fact that there's nothing odd about a normal man without a metal roof getting through his corrugated iron at such a rate that it runs out. A minute later, Ove turns up triumphantly in the doorway, dragging a gigantic piece of corrugated iron, as big as a living room rug. Anita honestly has no idea how such a large piece of metal has even fitted in there without her ever knowing about it. "Told you," says Ove with a nod, giving her back the key. Yes, you did, didn't you?" Anita feels obliged to admit. Ove turns to the window. Rune looks back, and just as Anita turns around to go back into the house, Rune grins again and lifts his hand in a brief wave. As if right there, just for a second, he knew exactly who Ove was and what he was doing there. Anita stops hesitantly, turns around. "They've been here from social services again. They want to take Rune away from me," she says without looking up. Her voice cracks like dry newspaper when she speaks her husband's name. Ove fingers the corrugated iron. "They say I'm not capable of taking care of him, with his illness and everything. They say he has to go into a home," she says. Ove continues fingering the corrugated iron. "He'll die if I put him in a home, Ove. You know that," she whispers. Ove nods and looks at the remains of a cigarette butt, frozen into the crack between two paving stones. Out of the corner of his eye, he notices how Anita is sort of leaning slightly to one side. Sonia explained about a year ago that it was the hip replacement operation, he remembers. Her hand shake as well these days. The first stage of multiple sclerosis, Sonia had also explained. And a few years ago, Rune got Alzheimer's as well. "Your lad can come and give you a hand then," he mumbles in a low voice. Anita looks up, looks into his eyes, and smiles indulgently. "Johann? He lives in America, you know. He's got enough on his own plate. You know how those young people are." Ove doesn't answer. Anita says America, as if it were the kingdom of heaven where her egotistical son has moved. Not once has Ove seen that brat here on the street since Rune sickened. Grown man now, but no time for his parents. Anita jumps to attention as if she's caught herself doing something disreputable. She smiles apologetically at Ove. Sorry, Ove, I shouldn't stand here talking and taking up your time with my nattering. She goes back into the house. Ove stays where he is with the sheet of corrugated iron in his hand and the cat at his side. He mutters something to himself just before the door closes. Anita turns around in surprise, peers out the crack, and looks at him. Pardon me? Ove twists without meeting her eyes. Then he turns and starts to leave, while his words slip out of him involuntarily. I said, if you have any more problems with those bloody radiators, you can come and ring my doorbell. The cat and me are at home. Anita's furrowed face pulls itself into a surprised smile. She takes half a step out the door, as if she wants to say something more. Maybe something about Sonia, how deeply she misses her best friend, how she misses what they had, all four of them, when they first moved onto this street almost 40 years ago. How she even misses the way Rune and Ove used to argue. But Ove has already disappeared around the corner. Back in his tool shed, Ove fetches the spare battery for the saw and 2 large metal clips. He lays out the sheet of corrugated iron across the paving stones between the shed and the house and carefully covers it with snow. He stands next to the cat, evaluating his creation for a long time. A perfect dog trap, hidden under snow, bursting with electricity, ready to bite. It seems a wholly proportionate revenge. The next time Blonde Weed passes by with that bloody mud of hers, and the latter gets the idea of peeing on Ove's paving, it'll do so onto an electrified field, conductive metal plate. And then let's see how amusing they find it, Ove thinks to himself. Wow. The cat tilts his head and looks at the metal sheet. Like a bolt of lightning up your urethra, says Ove. The cat looks at him for a long time, as if to say, you're not serious, are you? Eventually, Ove sticks his hands in his pockets and shakes his head. No, I suppose not, he sighs glumly. And then he packs up the battery and clamps and corrugated iron and puts everything in the garage. Not because he doesn't think those morons deserve a proper electric shock, because they do, but because he knows it's been a while since someone reminded him of the difference between being wicked because one has to be, or because one can. It was a bloody good idea, though, he concludes to the cat as they go back into the house. The cat goes into the living room with the dismissive body language of someone mumbling, sure it was. And then they have lunch. And that is the end of chapter 25. I sure am glad that cat has come into Ove's life. I kind of like that cat. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.